I never thought a heartbeat could change everything until hers pulled me into something real. I first noticed her on an ordinary Tuesday. I remember because the light was just right that morning, soft and golden, filtering through the cafe window and catching the dust motes like tiny floating stars. She was sitting alone at a corner table, a book open in front of her, yet she didn't read. Her eyes wandered, thoughtful, like she was listening to something no one else could hear. I handed her the cup of coffee she had accidentally left at the counter, and our fingers brushed. Just a fleeting touch, but enough to make me aware of the warmth of her skin, the subtle pulse at her wrist. There was something about her presence that felt grounding, not in a loud, commanding way, but quietly, deliberately steady. She didn't rush through life. She inhabited it fully. Her posture, the careful grace in her gestures, the slow, measured way she smiled when she looked up at me, all of it made the world seem slower, softer. I felt like I had stumbled into a space I wasn't quite prepared for, a space that demanded attention, presence, even reverence. As she accepted the coffee, her fingers lingered briefly on mine, a second or two longer than necessary, and I felt a strange awareness bloom in my chest. It wasn't desire in a brash, impatient way. It was something subtler, curiosity, fascination, the faintest pull of recognition, as if I had been missing something vital all my life, and only now glimpsed it. I tried to focus on the mundane, the steam rising from her cup, the faint scent of vanilla mixed with something uniquely hers. But I kept catching myself stealing glances, noticing the gentle tilt of her head when she laughed at some private thought, the way sunlight highlighted the soft strands of hair falling across her cheek. There was a quiet intimacy in the air, even though we were strangers, even though nothing had passed between us except that touch. I left the cafe that morning feeling unsettled, though not in a bad way. The world seemed just a touch sharper, more alive. I found myself replaying the moment over and over. The brush of her fingers, the soft steadiness of her gaze, the calm that seemed to radiate from her as naturally as breath. It wasn't dramatic, but it lingered, leaving an echo I couldn't ignore. It wasn't about attraction alone. It was more profound. Something about her heartbeat, literal and metaphorical, tugged at the edges of me. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. And in that tiny, fleeting contact, I realized something important. This wasn't going to be ordinary. Something real had begun, without warning, quietly unfolding in the space between a simple touch and a shared glance. By the time I walked away, I was already waiting for the next encounter, knowing instinctively that the world felt different when she was in it, slower, warmer, and impossibly alive. The next time I saw her, it wasn't by chance. At least, it didn't feel like it. She was sitting on the same cafe bench, a notebook open on her lap, a pen poised but still. I hesitated, unsure if I should disturb her, but something inside nudged me forward. The memory of her wrist against mine, her warmth lingering in my thoughts. I greeted her with a cautious smile, and she looked up, her eyes lighting briefly with recognition, a faint curve at the corner of her lips. Our conversation began as it often does with strangers, small talk, polite exchanges, but it quickly found its rhythm. She spoke with ease about the little things that had made her day, and I found myself sharing more than I usually would. My own routines, the quiet frustrations of work, the rare joys that had punctuated an otherwise ordinary week. Her laughter was soft, controlled but sincere, and when she tilted her head to listen, I caught the glint of curiosity in her eyes. She didn't just hear me. She seemed to absorb every word, letting it settle between us like sunlight on calm water. There were moments when our hands touched again, subtle, almost accidental. She reached across to adjust the sleeve of my jacket, her fingers brushing my skin lightly. My chest thudded unexpectedly, awareness blooming from the faint warmth of her touch. She didn't linger in a way that demanded attention, but the memory of her hand stayed with me long after she withdrew it. The sensation was gentle, reassuring, a silent promise of comfort without force, closeness without expectation. I began to notice more about her, The faint scent she carried, a mix of coffee, vanilla, and something uniquely her own, lingering even when she moved. The way her hair caught the light, strands slipping loose from a bun, the subtle crease in her brow when she concentrated, all of it drew my attention in a way that felt natural, unforced. I was aware of every gesture, every micro-expression, and yet I was careful not to let it show. Observing her became a quiet ritual, one that I secretly cherished. The quietest moment came near the end of our conversation. She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbow on the table, her fingers grazing mine as she emphasized a point. That fleeting contact was electric, though silent, as if her touch carried the calm steadiness of her heartbeat into my chest. I realized then that this wasn't just curiosity anymore. There was something deeper, a pull, subtle but undeniable, that went beyond words, beyond polite gestures. I left that day with a strange mixture of calm and anticipation. The warmth she brought lingered, not as a fleeting infatuation, but as a sense of safety, a quiet understanding that felt rare in my life. I found myself thinking not only about her presence, but about the way she made space for it, how effortlessly she allowed comfort, laughter, and subtle intimacy to unfold between us. Her heartbeat had begun to echo in my own, faint but persistent, drawing me into a rhythm that felt steady, warm, and unmistakably real. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't mind being caught in it. There was a moment, one of those rare, suspended moments, when words weren't necessary. It happened one late afternoon, the kind where the sunlight pours lazily across the room, casting long, golden shadows. She and I were sitting side by side on the worn couch of her living room, each nursing a cup of tea. Neither of us spoke much. The conversation from earlier had faded, leaving only the quiet comfort of shared presence. I became acutely aware of every subtle movement. The way her shoulder occasionally brushed mine as she shifted in her seat. The faint scent of her perfume, a delicate mix of jasmine and something warmer that wrapped around me and lingered in the soft air. I noticed the rise and fall of her chest with each breath, slow and steady, as though the world outside had receded entirely, leaving only this bubble of intimacy between us. It was in that quiet that I noticed her hand, just resting lightly on her lap, and before I could stop myself, I let my fingers brush against hers. It wasn't deliberate, not meant to provoke or impress, just a natural shift of proximity. Her hand was warm, soft, reassuring, and for a heartbeat, she didn't move away. The brush was fleeting, almost imperceptible, yet resonated in a way that words never could. I felt the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat beneath her skin, faint but unmistakable, and it echoed something inside me I hadn't realized I'd been missing. She caught my gaze then, and there was a flicker, subtle, almost shy, in her eyes. A silent acknowledgement, as if we both understood that this brush of hands, this quiet closeness, meant more than casual politeness. The air between us grew heavy, charged with something unspoken, longing, curiosity, and the weight of feelings that neither of us was yet ready to name. Her eyes drifted back to her cup, but I could feel the pull of her presence, magnetic and tender. I wanted to speak, to break the silence, yet every instinct told me to wait, to let the moment unfold naturally. In the stillness, even her slight movements, a tilt of the head, the gentle tapping of her fingers on the ceramic mug, felt meaningful, intimate, almost sacred. I realized then that silence could speak louder than words ever could. Her proximity, the warmth of her hand, the subtle cadence of her breathing, the softness in her gaze, all of it communicated a closeness that was delicate, respectful, and achingly real. The tension between us wasn't urgent or demanding. It was quiet, patient, and profoundly compelling. As I left her apartment later that day, I felt the lingering echo of her presence. Not just her scent or the warmth of her touch, but something deeper, the unspoken connection that had begun to root itself quietly in my chest. I knew this was more than fleeting fascination. Her heartbeat had reached me in ways I couldn't yet articulate, and I found myself drawn to it, slowly, inevitably, completely. It was a quiet evening when I first felt the real weight of what was happening between us. Up until now, our encounters have been gentle, almost effortless. Shared smiles, fleeting touches, conversations that lingered over coffee or tea. But that night, something shifted. I became aware, almost painfully, of how real this connection had grown. We were walking along a narrow path in the park, the sun dipping low behind the trees, casting long shadows that stretched across the cobblestones. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and fallen leaves, a crisp reminder of autumn settling in. She was talking about a book she loved, her voice soft but animated, and I listened, but my mind kept wandering to her, to the curve of her jaw as she smiled, the gentle sway of her hair catching the light, the way her hand occasionally brushed against mine as she emphasized a point. And then it hit me. This wasn't casual anymore. I realized how deeply I wanted her close, wanted to feel her warmth, wanted the quiet steadiness of her presence to linger. But fear rose alongside desire. Fear of overstepping, of misreading signals, of losing the fragile balance we'd built. I stepped back slightly, just enough for her to notice. She paused mid-sentence, the lively sparkle in her eyes dimming for the briefest second. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft, cautious. The concern in her tone tugged at me more than anything else. I hesitated, struggling to find words that wouldn't scare her away or diminish the closeness we shared. Then, as if sensing my turmoil, she reached for me. Her hand pressed gently against my chest, not with force, but with an almost magnetic insistence, grounding me. I felt the faint warmth of her palm through the fabric of my shirt, the subtle rhythm of her heartbeat pressing against my own. My chest tightened in a strange, unfamiliar way, and I realized I was holding my breath, waiting for her to pull back. Instead, she leaned forward, resting her cheek lightly against me for a moment, so brief it might have been mistaken for an accidental gesture. But I felt it, the warmth, the subtle pulse beneath her skin, the softness of her presence, as though she were offering reassurance in the simplest, quietest way possible. That small contact shattered the fear in me, just enough to make me realize how much I'd been denying to myself. We stayed like that for a heartbeat that felt like eternity, the world around us receding into shadows and golden light. Neither of us spoke, because words would have been clumsy, inadequate. In silence, she had given me more than I could have expected, a simple, honest gesture that said, "I see you. I feel this too." Walking away from that moment, I carried both exhilaration and trepidation. The emotional stakes had shifted, and I knew that from this point forward, nothing would feel ordinary. Her heartbeat had not only reached me, it had awakened something deep inside, something both thrilling and terrifying in its intensity. And for the first time, I understood that connection, real and undeniable, always comes with the risk of breaking. The days that followed our moment in the park were strange, not awkward, but charged with a new awareness. I found myself noticing her in ways I hadn't before. The subtle tilt of her head when she listened intently, the warmth in her smile that seemed to linger just a fraction longer, the way she unconsciously brushed her hair behind her ear. Every little gesture carried weight. Each glance felt heavier, as if the world had quietly shifted to accommodate something neither of us dared name. One afternoon, she invited me to her apartment to help her rearrange some shelves. It was a casual, simple thing, and yet the intimacy of being in her personal space made the air between us dense with unspoken emotion. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the warmth of the room, the softness of the throw on the couch, and how her fingers lightly lingered over objects as she moved. There was a quiet grace in her presence that made every small interaction feel significant. As we worked side by side, she spoke about her life, not in the small talk way we'd shared before, but with an openness that surprised me. She told me about moments she regretted, about decisions that had weighed on her, about fear she seldom voiced. Her voice was soft but steady, and as I listened, I realized how much I trusted her without fully understanding why. At one point, she paused, looking at me with a vulnerability that cut through the usual calm she carried. "I don't usually let people in," she said, almost as if confessing a fault. I met her gaze, and there was no judgment, only understanding. Without thinking, I reached out, letting my hand rest lightly atop hers. The warmth of her skin, the subtle leaving her apartment that day, I felt a rare clarity. The pull I had first sensed in fleeting touches and quiet glances was no longer a subtle whisper. It had grown into something steady and unwavering. Her presence had softened the distance between us, not through grand declarations or dramatic gestures, but through honesty, warmth, and the simple intimacy of being truly seen. And in that quiet, grounding way, I knew we were on the verge of something profoundly real, something neither of us could ignore. It happened in the quiet of her living room, late in the evening. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving a gentle twilight that filtered through the sheer curtains. The air was cool, tinged with the faint scent of jasmine from the small potted plant by the window. But between us, there was a warmth that seemed to pulse in rhythm with our own hearts. We had been talking softly, voices barely above a murmur, sharing fragments of our day and thoughts that neither of us usually gave voice to. Her laughter had become a familiar sound, soft yet vibrant, lingering in the spaces between words. And then, as if guided by some quiet instinct, she leaned closer, just slightly at first. Her forehead rested against my collarbone, tentative but deliberate, and the simple contact sent a shiver of recognition through me, a confirmation that the pull I had felt for weeks was no longer one-sided. I wrapped my arms around her slowly, carefully, giving her space even as I drew her closer. Her body fit against mine in a way that felt both familiar and new, the gentle press of her warmth grounding me. I could feel the subtle rhythm of her heartbeat through the fabric of her sweater, soft but insistent, steady and alive. It wasn't just a physical sensation. It was a message, a quiet declaration that this closeness was welcome, that the connection between us was real and mutual. Her breath was slow, and even as she rested there, yet I sensed the small tremors of emotion that always accompanied moments of honesty. I tilted my head slightly, pressing my cheek to her hair, inhaling the faint perfume that had become so intimately hers. It was a smell that spoke of calm mornings, quiet evenings, and the kind of comfort that could anchor you even in the chaos of the world outside. For a long moment, we stayed like that, suspended in a space that was both tender and transformative. I could feel her fingers brush lightly over my back, careful, gentle, reassuring, a quiet echo of everything we had been building together. And in that rhythm, that soft, shared heartbeat, I understood something profound. This was more than fleeting desire or curiosity. This was real, steady, and patient love, unfolding slowly but surely. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes met mine, glimmering in the muted light, and there was a softness there that made my chest ache with recognition. I smiled gently, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and she leaned into the touch, closing her eyes for a second as though to savor it. There were no words necessary. Everything we had felt, everything we had shared, was encapsulated in the warmth between us, in the calm steadiness of her heartbeat against mine. As I left that evening, walking home under the quiet hush of streetlights, I felt a rare clarity. What had begun as fleeting brushes of hands and stolen glances had evolved into something profoundly grounding, something undeniably real. Her heartbeat had answered mine, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to resist. I wanted to follow that rhythm, to stay close to it, to let it guide me into a connection that was as tender as it was certain. The days after that evening felt different, yet comfortably familiar. There was no rush, no pressure, only the gentle rhythm of lives intertwining. Each moment with her carried a quiet significance, a smile, a brush of fingers, the subtle warmth of her hand against mine. It was in these ordinary gestures, small yet meaningful, that the depth of our connection fully settled into place. One late afternoon, she invited me to her balcony to watch the sun lower itself behind the city skyline. The air was crisp, tinged with the faint scent of blooming flowers she had lined along the railing. We stood close, shoulders brushing naturally, hands occasionally grazing in that unspoken rhythm we had developed. I could feel the gentle thrum of her heartbeat against my side, steady and reassuring, and it filled me with a quiet, almost tender awe, the simple truth of her presence grounding me in a way that words could never capture. We talked about everything and nothing, stories from the past, hopes for the future, and the fleeting, funny moments that made life unexpectedly bright. She leaned against me, her head resting lightly on my shoulder, and I draped an arm around her, careful, slow, deliberate. Her fingers found mine and intertwined with a comfort that spoke louder than any declaration. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't sudden, it was real, soft and steady, the kind of closeness that promised presence, trust, and care. Her eyes met mine, glimmering with warmth, and I saw the reflection of our shared journey there. The quiet beginnings, the hesitant touches, the moments of vulnerability that had slowly built into trust and affection. I brushed a strand of hair from her face, and she leaned into the gesture, eyes closing for a heartbeat, savoring the intimacy. Every subtle movement, every gentle sigh, felt like a punctuation mark in the story we had begun writing together. It was in that quiet space that I realized something important. This wasn't the climax of a fleeting romance. This was the beginning of something real. Our heartbeat rhythms had synced not through grand gestures or loud confessions, but through shared time, attention, honesty, and the soft, deliberate giving of space and care. The warmth between us, once tentative and cautious, now felt steady, unshakable, and profoundly comforting. I rested my forehead briefly against hers, feeling the soft weight of her presence, and she smiled, small, knowing, and utterly sincere. No words were necessary. The comfort of our closeness, the steady pulse of her heartbeat beneath my palm, and the quiet smile on her lips said everything that needed to be said. As the city faded into evening lights and the first stars appeared in the sky, I understood with a clarity that was both grounding and exhilarating. Her heartbeat had not only pulled me close, but it guided me into something lasting, tender, and undeniably real. And in that soft, quiet certainty, I found a peace I had been searching for all along. This was no fleeting spark. This was the warmth of honesty, the steadiness of connection, and the beginning of a love that would grow slowly, deliberately, beautifully, a heartbeat at a time.